Thank you, Program Director, event organizers and sponsors. Thank you for inviting the DOE to be part of this discussion. We value such forums because we believe that they provide the clarity that's required to be able to allow the members of the public to give input into the draft IRP that we've published. Just as the start, actually, this is not the first interaction we've been having. We've had interactions with a number of associations. As we get invited, we go and interact on the IRP. So we basically not in terms of who we interact with. So we are available to engage anyone at obviously convenient time for obviously the department and whomever wants to engage the department. Without wasting time, my task here is just to probably help those who haven't read the document, just to put out there some of the key things in issues or some of the key findings of the IRP. But yes, we encourage you to read the document and to give us the input. Infrastructure in the country. Obviously, while we do that, you aim to balance a number of objectives, and not in any order. And those objectives are to ensure security of supply, to minimize as much as possible the cost of supply, and to minimize the environmental impact. What the IRP in the current format is not a procurement plan. It's not a plan to decide who buys, who sells. That is done through Section 34, which is the determination. So the IRP is to tell you in terms of supply and demand, what are the options that are available to us and which options give us the plan that is very close to meeting our objectives. Those who have been following the space will know that the first IRP was promulgated in 2011, and that IRP as well followed a process where there were public consultations, and as part of that IRP there was what we call policy adjustment, and I will go into the detail later in terms of what is policy adjustment. But basically, those who know, you'll know that the least cost options in 2010 did not include some of the new technologies. So policy adjustments were made to include some of the new technologies that today are part of the least cost solutions that we have on the table. Why are we reviewing or revising the IRP? The main reason for that is that assumptions as we had them in the 2010 IRP have significantly changed. And I'm saying significantly changed because assumptions change every day. So it's about how significant those assumptions have changed and the implication in terms of the plan. This slide here, we're just trying to give context in terms of where the IRP fits in the context of the IEP. This is still out for debate. There are those that believe that the IEP must precede everything, and there are those that believe that you must first do sector plans and the IEP must integrate. I'm with the school that says that you must first complete your sector plans because then it gives you a view of your sectors, and then you must aggregate and manage the interactions between the plans. I'm not going to go into this slide. In terms of the IRP update process, when we updated the IRP, we had 4 milestones of 4 key stages that we're working on. The first one was the development of input assumptions. The second one was the development of a base case or a starting point and scenario analysis, the production of a balance plan, and the last stage is policy adjustment and the development of a draft or final plan. You'll remember that towards the end of 2016, we went out with on a public consultation on the assumptions. As part of that, we also published a preliminary base case, which somehow became the focus instead of the actual assumptions. But the idea at the time was to say, in long-term planning, it's less about the output, but it's more about, the output, but it's more about the input, the assumption that you put on the plan. So what we wanted to avoid at the time was to say, let's get everyone as close as possible with regard to the assumptions before we go and do the detailed plans. That process was done over the 9 provinces. And here we're just summarizing. We actually received about 190 written submissions. I think less than 10% of that were actually substantive. Most of the comments that we received were mostly just saying, so-and-so said this, why don't you do this? And I think it's one of the things I want to appeal to today, to say it helps us if your comments are substantive, because in terms of the process, what we try and do is to make sure that whatever we do is transparent. So if you're going to tell us that we haven't considered this, we're supposed to be able to refer the general public to the source document, for whatever information that we use in the plan. So where there's information supporting some of the suggestions, we will prefer that you share that with us. Without going into the details, the comments that we received around the assumptions were around the process, and the issue there was the timing of the IRP and all that. There were issues around the demand forecast at the time, because the forecast that we had was done in 2015, where in 2016, the real data that was available indicated that we were already overestimating demand, and we were asked to go and review the demand, and the demand has since been reviewed and revised accordingly as it's published on the website. There were main issues around technology costs. We had used the average cost, I think, for bid window 3.5, and at the time there was a study that was referring to the cost from expedited. But again, the reason we do that is because as part of the IRP, expedited costs were actually not public, in the public domain at the time. So what we use is what we should be able to put out in the public domain. But we've since revised the cost because the IPP office made available the cost in relation to the expedited. There was an issue around the exchange rate. We had assumed, because our studies were packed at 2015 January, and the exchange rate was about 11.55. At the time when we were out in December, it was 16 to the dollar. We've revised it. I think we use about now 13.55, but we know that we're in 14. Tomorrow it might be 15. But we believe that because this is a comparative exercise, the energy mix between the options should not significantly change, or be influenced by the exchange rate that you use. But obviously we believe that in terms of affordability and all that, obviously exchange rate comes into play. There were issues around how do we account for demand side. And the big one, it was around constraint on renewables. I was joking yesterday to some colleagues that we prefer to call it annual build limits on renewables, because the other one seems to suggest that we're trying to constrain renewables. But the idea was never to constrain renewables, was that in 2010, because we didn't know what we didn't know, there was a decision to say, let's place constraint on renewables in terms of annual limits on renewables in terms of the ability for us to roll out the program. And to put it into context, I think there was 1,000 for PV and 1,600 for wind. On average, if you take lead time of about 2 years, 24 months for the PV project, it means at any point in time, if you assume an average plant size of 100 megawatts, it means at any point in time out there, there'll be about 20 plants under construction. It just to put the number 1,000 megawatts into context. And as I indicated, we revised the assumptions as was necessary based on information that we received. But the key assumptions that we think are important for this forum to note is that the electricity demand outlook as forecasted in 2010 IRP has not been realized. I think when we looked at it, I think we are currently, compared to 2010, it's about 30% less than what we were predicting. And for a number of reasons, prices have increased. There's made substitutes more obviously affordable or more competitive. People have undertaken a number of energy efficiency improvements to obviously mitigate against the increasing electricity prices. There's an ever-increasing number of people who are taking up on generation. Fuel switching most people in here are probably using gas now to cook, using solar to heat their water. So that is all the demand that used to be on the grid that's actually now starting to find another way to service itself. But I think one of the biggest assumptions that a lot of people, or one of the biggest changes that a lot of people don't think about is that since the IRP 2010, with demand on the grid that's going down, we've actually committed, and committed meaning up to the 27 IPP project that were signed, we've committed to about 18,000 megawatt of new capacity. That's still, some of it is already online, some of it is still coming online. So while demand is going down, we've committed in terms of capacity, which is a very, very important factor, because later on you'll understand why the results in terms of the analysis come out the way they come out. So this 18,000 include obviously Medupi and Kusile and Ngula up to the 2022. One of the other things that have changed is obviously the lower than anticipated existing ESCOM plan performance, constrained transmission network, and obviously changes in technology costs. When the team that worked on RP did the analysis, we, as I indicated, in terms of demand on the grid currently, demand on the grid is said to be actually at levels less than the 2007 levels. And as you can see here, we're very optimistic. We're still assuming that there will be demand coming on the grid going forward, but we know that other technologies are starting to take over. But what we find is that the biggest driver, assuming everything else remain constant, for new capacity going forward will be the decommissioning of existing ESCOM plants. In our plan, we assume the 50-year life. For those plants, we assume that when they reach the 50-year life, they are actually going to be decommissioned. In terms of the forecast, we assume what we call the high less intense, meaning that the driver in terms of the industrial sectors will be not necessarily the heavy intensive users, it will be other industries, and that from a GDP point of view is associated with around, I think, about 4% or so GDP growth. Using the assumptions that we had worked out or we had revised, we studied a number of scenarios, and those scenarios included the growth scenarios. We tested a number of growth scenarios. We also tested what we call the gas scenario. And with the gas scenario, what did we mean is that we assumed the gas price as a starting point, and in the first scenario, we increased it with inflation. And you can argue that that's assuming that you have gas locally or something like that. The other one, we increased the gas price by linking it to the spot market price, and we used the EIA, International Energy Agency projections in terms of the price of gas to superimpose the price going forward. We tested the renewable scenario. The renewable scenario is where we actually remove the annual build limits to see what the plan looks like. We tested the emission reduction scenario. In the emission reduction scenario, you know that in the 2010, how we kept the emissions, we were using the peak plateau decline, meaning we are going to peak as we complete Medupi, Kusile, Ngula. We're going to plateau for a while, and then we're going to decline as we decommission some of the coal power plants. But one of the other approach that Environmental Affairs is looking at is carbon budget per sector, and they gave us numbers for the energy sector for us to look at, to test, which we tested it's contained in the report. In analyzing the results, the difference between this plan and the 2010 is that we did the study up to 2050, and to analyze the results, we obviously, if you stand at 2050, you'll make a different decision compared to if you stand at 2030. But we also believed when we looked at the results that your degree of certainty in terms of your assumptions, as you go deeper into the future, becomes bigger and the debates grow. So you'll see that then we decided to obviously narrow. I'm aware that I've got about 5 minutes. So in terms of from the study, the high level in terms of the findings is that the review of the IRP indicate that the pace and scale of new capacity developments needed up to 2030 will have to be curtailed or slowed down compared to what we had in the IRP 2010. Obviously, from the department point of view, we'll have to relook at determinations that we had issued in line with the 2010 IRP, post the 27 projects. One of the key things is that we also note that without policy intervention, a whole lot of other technologies will not go into the mix if you stick and PV. But again, it's gas based on the price of gas that we've assumed. What we also note is that because of the magnitude of the decommissioning that happens post 2030, fiddling with your assumptions changes the energy mix that you'll basically end up with. So that part of the study is very sensitive to the assumptions that you're looking at. Before 2030, we did not pick up. The energy mix comes out fairly the same, I mean, amongst the scenarios that we've done. And we then took a decision that we will confirm, for policy certainty, we'll confirm the plan up to 2030. And because of the big swings that we see post 2030, a number of discussions will have to happen to firm up on the assumptions post that period. When we do that, the plan that you see comes out to be in a form of the least cost plan, which is there. This is the plan that comes straight out of the model in terms of least cost. And what you'll see here is that, I mean, the first, besides gas, the first PV and wind projects come around 2027, 2028. And this is because of the point that I mentioned earlier. There's about 18 gigawatts of power that has been committed during this period. So as those projects come in line, obviously it means that you don't necessarily require additional capacity. So, and this is purely based on least cost. It's saying, I mean, if you deploy it at that point, this is the cheapest solution you can put in place. But what we also tested, what we also observed, is that if you, on one of the renewable scenarios, when you put annual build limits, what happens? What happens when you put annual build limits? You realize that it spreads the two technologies earlier, as you can see there. And the reason is because when you do that, the model is basically saying that even with you constraining how much renewables should come on an annual basis, it is still cheaper to deploy renewables earlier and gas than to deploy something else. Basically, that's what that picture is showing you. And that's why we make the statement that constraining does not significantly change the energy mix or what you see pre-2030. Post-2030, it's a different picture, as I'd indicated. Now, using that as a starting point, then we made a number of proposals. How do we move to policy adjustment? The basis of moving to policy adjustment is that we look at other existing government policies and commitments that the government would have made prior to the plan being revised. And the two key ones that were there was that we have got a treaty with the DRC in terms of the development of Inga. So we had to find space in terms of us honoring that agreement that is currently in place. There is, I think, around 1,000 megawatts of coal that was procured and announced, but obviously not yet signed, which we consider, and the advice that we got is that it's a commitment that we've made because we've announced. And we actually also have to look at those plans. Are we aware that there are other issues, court challenges and all those things, but we cannot obviously preempt the outcome of that. From a government point of view, we have to draw the line. In the same manner that we did with the 27 IPP projects we had announced, we had to carry through with the commitment that we had made as government. Otherwise, we go back into we become inconsistent and we create policy uncertainty. So that's the position that we took. The other adjustments that we're proposing, let me start with this one here. There's an issue around the allocation for own generation. Those who have been trying to get licenses, you'll know that when you go to the regulator, you hit a brick wall because you are told you are not in the IRP. So with regard to this one, the idea is actually to cure that problem, to basically say that put it in the IRP or recognize it in the IRP so that you do away with the need to go and request a ministerial determination. We started with 200. We've had discussions with a number of people. They've made suggestions and indicated why that is too little. We'll look at it obviously based on the inputs that's coming through. There was no science behind the number because no one at that point in time could actually give us the concrete numbers. The other one has to do with this one here, but maybe I should talk to this one at the end of the presentation once I've shown the other slide. When this table here indicates the plan with the policy adjustments that I've mentioned, it also shows you this is the committed capacity that I was talking about as it comes online in yellow. I hope we all see it as yellow. And then this is the 1,000 megawatts of coal for 2023-24. And when you do this, obviously when you do policy adjustment, you first things you have to go and re-optimize the study. So that's why you see that some of the capacities are slightly lower and the gas has also moved down. There's been an issue that was raised around that gap. We've taken note of that and what its implications will be on, obviously, on the industry. But the point I would like to emphasize, and before I can conclude, Program Director, is that I think what needs to be understood is that any move, any deviation from the least cost adds cost. I think that needs to be understood. And regardless of technology, this has got additional cost to the consumer because it means that the consumers are going to have to pay for that energy earlier than it is actually required if everything else remains the same. So the same thing applies when you include coal and when you include Inga. It's additional cost. And I'm not going to go into those numbers. The numbers are there in the report. So as we stand, this is the plan as we see it. But the other policy consideration that I jumped is because we also believe that in order to ensure innovation, most efficient power system, and evolution to lowest cost, any resource that can provide a required service to the power system that is supply-side character should be able to compete. And what do we mean by that? What we mean is that we believe that these things must be proxies rather than absolute. You know, because at the point when you procure, at that point in time, there could be another technology of the same characteristic at the same price that should be able to compete. Ideally, what you'd want to do, I mean, we had this discussion yesterday with colleagues from the CSR. Ideally, what you want to do is you'd want to have an IRP that does not necessarily, I know for investors, they wouldn't want that. They want certainty, you know, but ideally, from a technical point of view, you'll want an IRP that does not talk to a specific technology. It tells you what the system wants and the best technology to fit into that gap, you know, and I think it's something that over time we'll have to find a way to migrate to. But for now, obviously, we use this. I was saying to someone, if the model doesn't know PV on it looks at a characteristic. If I had named this thing coal, it would have come out, you know, because it looks for a characteristic, not the name of the technology. So that's how we look at these things. And in that case, we believe that, for example, if batteries can occupy at the right price and compete with gas at that point in time, then batteries should be considered. And how do you do this? Section 34, the new regulations allow the Minister of Energy at the point when she issues a Section 34 to ask for a feasibility study to be undertaken. So you can actually manage it that way. The last point, how do we make sure that with regard to the long-term plan, and this is just a summary when you sit in 2030 in terms of the capacities that you see. For post-2030, we recommend a number of studies. I'm not going to go through them. There are many others we've been discussing with other research institutes where they are recommending a whole lot of additional studies that we need to consider, and we are open to that. To conclude, Chair, what we're saying is that in long-term planning, it's not about how accurate your assumptions are. It is how flexible the solution that you're actually putting on the table is. I can tell you we can all guess what demand will be on the system tomorrow here or in next year. We'll all get it wrong. You know, it is just, you know, but it is how the solution that we provide to meeting that demand, how flexible it is to the changing assumptions, that is more important. I'll leave it at that, Chair.
Thank you.